The rain had been falling since early morning, the kind of slow, relentless rain that soaks everything it touches without ever seeming to hurry. Inside the Calvary Memorial Chapel on Deerfield Avenue, the flowers were already wilting at the edges. The air smelled of carnations and old wood polish, and the organ had been playing the same hymn for 15 minutes, low and mournful, as though it didn't know how to stop. Loretta Mae Caldwell sat in the third row. Not the first, not the second. She had chosen the third row deliberately, the way she did most things in her life quietly, without demanding attention, leaving the front space for those who felt entitled to it. She wore a black dress she had sewn herself, simple and well made, with small pearl buttons down the front. Her hands rested in her lap, still and composed, the way hands rest when they have learned over many years that stillness costs less than motion. Walter Hargrove had died 6 days ago, a Thursday morning, just before 7, in the bedroom of the house on Magnolia Street where Loretta had cared for him through his final 2 years. He had been awake for a little while before the end, and he had held her hand, and he had said something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. But she wouldn't say it here, not in this room, not to these people. She had not expected to be welcomed. She had hoped, at least, to be ignored. She was not ignored. Diane Hargrove Whitfield arrived 12 minutes into the service, which meant she arrived after the first hymn but before the pastor's opening remarks, a timing that Loretta suspected had been calculated. Diane was 44, blonde in the particular way that requires great expense to maintain, and dressed in a fitted charcoal suit that had cost more than Loretta's monthly rent. She walked to the front of the chapel, flanked by her husband, Gerald, who was tall and soft-jawed, and always looked faintly uncomfortable, and by her brother Colton, who walked slightly behind them both and stared at the floor. Diane did not look at Loretta when she passed, but she had seen her. Loretta knew it. The service proceeded. Reverend Dumas spoke with warmth and sincerity about Walter Hargrove, his years of work as a civil engineer, his late wife Margaret, his children, his community involvement, his faith. He did not mention Loretta by name. She had not expected him to. But when he spoke about the last years of Walter's life, about the peace Walter had found and the love that had surrounded him at the end, his eyes found hers for just a moment. That was enough. After the final hymn, before anyone had risen from their seats, Diane stood. She did not ask permission. She did not wait for an appropriate moment. She simply stood, turned to face the gathered mourners, perhaps 60 people, and said, in a voice that carried the full confidence of someone who had never been told to sit down, "Before we proceed to the burial, I need to address something that my family has discovered." The room went quiet in a way that felt physical, like air being pulled from a space. "My father," Diane said, "was a generous man. He was also, in his final years, a vulnerable man. A man whose judgment was compromised by illness, by grief, and by those who sought to take advantage of that vulnerability." Loretta did not move. "We have learned," Diane continued, "that a document was produced in the final months of my father's life, purporting to be his last will and testament, that leaves a significant portion of his estate, including this family's home on Magnolia Street, to a woman who was employed as his caregiver." Someone in the back of the room made a sound. Not quite a gasp, more like a held breath released. "That woman is present in this room today." Every head turned, not all at once. One by one, like a slow wave, people turned to look. And because Loretta was the only black woman in the third row, the only black woman in the room who wasn't serving it, took no effort at all for 60 pairs of eyes to find her. Loretta sat very still. "We believe," Diane said, her voice dropping to something that was almost sympathetic, which made it worse, that this document was obtained through manipulation and undue influence. That my father was not in a sound state of mind when it was signed, and that the appropriate legal authorities will agree. She reached into the inside pocket of her suit jacket. She produced several folded sheets of paper. And in front of 60 witnesses, in the Calvary Memorial Chapel on a rainy Wednesday morning, Diane Hargrove Whitfield tore them in half. The sound was very small, like a leaf breaking, but it landed in the room like something much larger. "This family," Diane said, refolding the torn pieces carefully and setting them on the pew beside her, "will not be robbed. Not by anyone. And certainly not at his funeral." She sat down. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a low murmur began, moving through the room the way rumors always move, fast and formless, finding all the gaps. Loretta looked at her hands. She did not cry. She did not speak. She did not stand to defend herself. What she did in that moment was something only she could see. She made a small decision, not about the house or the money or what people in that room now believed about her. The decision was simpler than all of that. She decided to stay. Loretta Mae Caldwell had grown up in the same county where she now lived, in a town called Greer's Mill that no longer appeared on most maps, 22 miles east of the city. She had been the second of 4 children, the daughter of a woman who cleaned hotel rooms for 30 years and a father who drove long-haul trucks until his knees gave out. Neither of them had finished high school. Both of them had worked without complaint. Loretta had inherited their stillness, their sense of proportion, the ability to know what mattered and let the rest pass. She had trained as a licensed practical nurse in her 20s, working at County General for 11 years before a back injury forced her off the floor. She'd spent the following years doing home care, private clients, mostly elderly, mostly alone. She was good at it. Not because she performed warmth, but because she had it. She knew the difference between listening and waiting to speak. She knew when a person needed company and when they needed quiet. She knew that the dying often had things they wanted to say if someone would simply stay in the room long enough to hear them. She had never married. She had come close, once, in her mid-30s, with a man named Douglas, who taught math at the middle school and read history books on weekends. But Douglas had moved away, and Loretta had stayed, and the years had settled around her like sediment. Her apartment on Crestwood Lane was on the second floor of a building that had been built in 1971 and hadn't been significantly updated since. The hallway smelled of other people's cooking. Her door had 3 locks, which she used every night. Inside, the apartment was small and precise furniture arranged the way she liked it. Everything clean, surfaces clear except for what was meant to be there. On the bookshelf beside the window, there was a photograph in a plain wooden frame. It showed a younger Loretta, perhaps 35, standing outside what appeared to be a hospital. She was not smiling, exactly, but her face carried something that resembled relief. The photo was slightly overexposed on one side, the way photos taken in a hurry tend to be. She rarely looked at it directly, but she never put it away. Beside it, tucked upright between 2 books, was an envelope, old, sealed, slightly yellow at the edges. Her name was written on the front in handwriting that was not her own, a man's handwriting, precise and deliberate. The postmark had faded to near invisibility. She had never opened it. Her neighbor, Priscilla Odom, was the closest thing Loretta had to a confidant, which meant Priscilla knew a few things most people didn't, and suspected many more. They had been neighbors for 9 years. Priscilla worked at the county library, was twice divorced, and had a laugh that could be heard from 2 floors away. She brought Loretta food when Loretta forgot to eat, which happened more than Loretta admitted. On the evening after the funeral, Priscilla sat at Loretta's kitchen table with a container of soup she'd made and watched Loretta move around the kitchen with the careful economy of a person holding themselves very deliberately together. "You need to call a lawyer," Priscilla said. "I know." "Not tomorrow. Tonight if you can, or first thing in the morning. I know, Priscilla, because what that woman did in there, I was there." Priscilla set down her spoon. "Loretta, look at me." Loretta stopped. She turned from the counter and looked at her friend. "What did he put in that will?" A long pause. Outside, the rain had started again. "The house on Magnolia Street," Loretta said, "and a sum of money, enough to matter. And did he have the right mind to do it? He was clearer in his last 6 months than he'd been in years." She said it without heat, as a statement of fact. The palliative care team can confirm that. His doctor can confirm it. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Then why are you standing in your kitchen looking like you've already lost?" Loretta turned back to the counter. She picked up a dish towel and folded it slowly, the way she folded everything. "Because I've been here before," she said. "Not exactly here, but in rooms where people had already decided who I was before I opened my mouth. And I know how much energy it takes to change that." Priscilla was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've never told me everything, have you?" It wasn't really a question. "No," Loretta said, "I haven't." On the bookshelf behind her, the sealed yellow envelope stood between its two books. Priscilla glanced at it. She had noticed it before, over the years, and then looked back at Loretta and decided not to ask. What she didn't know, and what Loretta had never told anyone in this city, was that the handwriting on that envelope belonged to Walter Hargrove, and that he had written it 23 years ago, not long after an event that had changed both their lives, and left it with her to keep sealed for reasons that had seemed important at the time, and had grown more complicated with every year that passed. Some things Loretta had learned you carry not because you want to, but because no one else knows they need carrying. By the following Monday, the story had traveled, not through newspapers. The Hargrove family situation wasn't prominent enough for that kind of coverage, but through the channels that have always moved information fastest in mid-sized southern cities. Church networks, professional circles, the quiet telephone trees of people who know people who know people. Within 4 days of the funeral, Loretta's name was attached to a narrative she had not written. The narrative said, a caregiver had taken advantage of a dying man. It didn't use those words, exactly. It never did. What people said was things like, "You know he wasn't well at the end, and she was there every day, so of course she had influence, and it's a shame, really his family is devastated." The word manipulation was used often. The phrase undue influence appeared, which told Loretta that Diane had been speaking to people with legal vocabulary. On Tuesday, a letter arrived from an attorney named Bryce Calloway, representing the Hargrove estate on behalf of Diane and Colton Hargrove. The letter stated that the document Loretta was believed to possess or reference as Walter Hargrove's final will had been contested, and that any attempt to act on its provisions would be met with immediate legal challenge on grounds of testamentary incapacity and undue influence. On Wednesday, the agency that had placed Loretta with Walter Hargrove called to inform her that her registration with them had been temporarily suspended pending the outcome of the legal matter. On Thursday, the property management company that managed her building sent a notice that her lease renewal due in 6 weeks was under review due to an unspecified complaint. One thing at a time, the structure of her daily life was being dismantled with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before and had good lawyers. Loretta read each piece of correspondence at her kitchen table. She made notes in a small spiral notebook with a blue pen. She did not panic, but she felt the weight of it accumulating not on her chest, exactly, but somewhere deeper, in the place where a person keeps their sense of what is survivable. She called a lawyer named Adele Marks, who had been recommended by Priscilla. Adele was 50, sharp, and charged a reasonable rate for initial consultations. She met Loretta at her office on Friday afternoon and listened without interruption for 40 minutes. "They tore up a copy," Adele said when Loretta finished. "I believe so. Do you know if the original was filed with a notary?" "Walter told me it had been notarized and filed. He was specific about it. He said," she paused, choosing her words. "He said he wanted to make sure it was real, official, so no one could question it." Adele wrote something in her legal pad. "Do you know the notary's name?" "Arthur Fenwick. He has an office on Callaway Street, I believe." "Good." Adele looked up. If it was properly executed and filed, tearing up a copy means nothing legally. A filed will is a public document. Diane Hargrove knows this. Then why did she do it? Adele considered for a moment. Because she wasn't performing for the court. She was performing for the room. She wants people to believe the will doesn't exist. She wants you to feel so exposed, so scrutinized, so legally vulnerable that you walk away before the probate process even begins. Loretta sat with that for a moment. She nearly succeeded. "Nearly," Adele said. "But you're here." The meeting gave Loretta something she hadn't had since the funeral. A small foothold. Not solid ground, not yet, but something to stand on while she figured out the next step. What she didn't tell Adele not that day was that the will was only part of it. The house and the money mattered, yes, but what kept her up at night was something else entirely. Something she had been carrying for 23 years that had nothing to do with the legal dispute and everything to do with why Walter Hargrove had written that will in the first place. Diane believed she was fighting over an inheritance. She had no idea what she was actually standing in the middle of. That same Friday evening, a car Loretta didn't recognize was parked outside her building for 2 hours. A dark blue sedan, engine off, no one visible inside. It was there when she returned from Adele's office, and gone when she looked again at 9 o'clock. She didn't know who had sent it, but she noticed. She always noticed things like that. And in the bookshelf by the window, the sealed yellow envelope waited in the dark, the way certain truths wait not impatiently, but with the absolute certainty that eventually they will be opened. The object she had carried longest was not the envelope. It was a quilt. Small, lap-sized, the kind you'd fold over the lower half of a person sitting in a chair. Made from squares of blue and cream fabric, hand-stitched with a border pattern that Loretta's mother had taught her when she was 11 years old. Solid stitching, even tension. The kind of work that took patience and practice and couldn't be faked. She had made it in her early 30s, during a winter when she'd had more evenings free than she knew what to do with. It had lived in the back seat of her car for years. She'd meant to bring it inside, and never got around to it, the way you don't get around to things that seem minor. Then, one night, it stopped being minor. She still had it. It sat folded on the shelf in her bedroom closet, behind a row of hanging clothes. In a cotton pillowcase she'd put it in years ago to keep the dust off. She rarely took it out, but she never got rid of it. The Friday after her meeting with Adele, Loretta received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was a man's older, slightly hoarse, with the careful diction of someone who had spent years being precise with words. "Is this Loretta Caldwell?" he said. "It is." A pause. "My name is Raymond Hargrove. Walter was my son." She had known Walter's father existed. Walter had spoken of him with the complicated mixture of admiration and distance that sons often reserve for fathers who were great men in public and less present in private. Raymond Hargrove had been a federal judge for 22 years, retired now, in his early 70s. Living in Savannah. "Yes," Loretta said carefully. "Walter spoke of you. I've heard about what happened at the funeral." His voice was controlled, but she could hear something beneath the control, not quite anger, but something adjacent to it. "I want you to know that I am not aligned with my granddaughter's position." She waited. "I'd like to meet with you," he said, "if you're willing." They arranged a meeting for the following Tuesday at a coffee shop on the east side of town. She wrote his name and number in her blue notebook and set it on the kitchen table. Then she sat for a long time without moving. It was Priscilla who first noticed something strange, 3 days later, in a way that she mentioned almost as an aside. She had been helping Loretta go through some papers, financial records, correspondence with Walter, anything that might be useful for Adele. They were sitting at the kitchen table with the documents spread between them when Priscilla picked up a photograph that had slipped from between 2 envelopes. It was a hospital photo, taken inside a ward somewhere. A man in a hospital bed, young, perhaps mid-20s, looking pale and slightly bewildered, the way people look when they have been frightened recently and the fright hasn't entirely left their face. Beside the bed stood a nurse Loretta didn't recognize. The man's left arm was bandaged from wrist to elbow. "Who's this?" Priscilla asked. Loretta looked at the photograph for a moment longer than the question required. "Someone I used to know," she said. Priscilla turned the photo over. On the back, in faint pencil, was a date, November 14, and a year that was 23 years ago. Beneath the date, 2 words written in handwriting that wasn't Loretta's, "Thank you." "The same handwriting as the envelope on your shelf," Priscilla said quietly. Loretta didn't confirm or deny it. She took the photograph gently from Priscilla's hand and set it face down on the table. But Priscilla, who was observant in the way that librarians tend to be observant, had already noticed something else. The man in the photograph, the young man with the bandaged arm and the pale, frightened face, had a particular quality to his features, a particular way of holding his jaw, a structure to his brow. She had seen something similar recently. At the funeral. 3rd row from the front, on the aisle, sitting slightly apart from both Loretta and the family. A man in his late 40s, who had looked lost and said nothing to anyone for the entire service. Colton Hargrove. She said nothing about this to Loretta. Not yet. But the observation settled somewhere in the back of her mind and stayed there, waiting for the right moment to mean something. Raymond Hargrove was not what Loretta had expected, which was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected authority. The gravity of a man who had spent decades being the most important person in most rooms. She had expected to feel, sitting across from him, something of what she sometimes felt in government offices, the subtle but unmistakable pressure of institutional weight. What she found instead was a man who was tired. He was tall, grey-haired, with the deliberate posture of someone who had kept himself physically careful over many years. He wore a jacket that had been expensive once and wasn't new. He arrived before her, which she noted, and stood when she entered, which she also noted. They ordered coffee. For a moment, neither spoke. "Walter called me," Raymond said finally, "about a year before he died. We hadn't spoken much in the previous decade. Our relationship was complicated." A pause. "Most relationships are, when you look at them honestly." He mentioned that. "What did he say?" "That you loved each other in the way that 2 people sometimes do when they've disappointed each other enough times that the love runs deeper than the disappointment." His words. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief. "That sounds like him." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. His knuckles were prominent, the hands of a man who was older than he had perhaps expected to be. "When he called me," Raymond continued, "he wanted to talk about something specific, about a decision he had made regarding his estate. He said he wanted me to know in advance, because he said he stopped. He said he was correcting a debt." Loretta looked at her cup. "He didn't tell me the details of what he meant by that," Raymond said. "I assumed it was something financial. Something he felt he owed someone from his business years." He looked at her directly for the first time. "But then Diane called me after the funeral." She told me what was in the will, and she told me who you were. What did she tell you about me? That you were a caregiver who had manipulated a sick man into leaving you his property. And do you believe that?" He took a long breath. "No," he said, "I don't, because I know my son." And because the way he spoke about correcting a debt, it wasn't the way a man speaks when someone has tricked him. It was the way a man speaks when he has been carrying something for a long time and finally found the nerve to set it down. Loretta wrapped her own hands around her cup. They sat like that for a moment, two people circling the edge of something they both knew was there. "Mr. Hargrove," she said carefully, "why did you want to meet me?" "Because I think you know something," he said, "and I think my son wanted you to know it. And I think whatever it is has been sitting between your family and mine for a long time, and no one has ever said it out loud." The coffee shop was moderately busy. A table of college students with laptops, a couple reading separate books, the sound of the espresso machine. Normal life, indifferent to what was being said in the corner. Loretta looked at Raymond Hargrove's hands on the cup. And then she looked at his face, really looked, in the way she sometimes allowed herself to look at things that had been in her peripheral vision for a long time. The jaw, the brow, the particular set of the eyes. She had seen something like that face before, 23 years ago in a hospital room, younger, frightened, bandaged from wrist to elbow. She didn't say anything about that. Not yet. But something shifted inside her, a small tectonic shift, the kind that doesn't make any visible movement on the surface, but reorganizes everything underneath. "I'll tell you what I know," she said, "when the time is right." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded, slowly, in the way that people nod when they understand that the right time is not yet, but it's coming. "There's something else," he said. He reached inside his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully and set it on the table between them, not pushing it toward her, just placing it there. It was a copy of a document. She recognized the format immediately. A probate filing. "Arthur Fenwick filed the will with the county probate court 4 days before Walter died," Raymond said. "It's official. It's on record. My granddaughter tore up nothing but paper." Loretta looked at the document. The name at the top was Walter James Hargrove. The primary beneficiary was Loretta Mae Caldwell. Below her name, in the careful legal language of such documents, was a clause that read, "In recognition of a debt that can never be fully repaid, and in gratitude for an act of courage and compassion that this testator has carried in his heart for 23 years. She read that sentence twice. Then she folded her hands in her lap, looked out the window at the street, and let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of 23 years pressing against the inside of her chest. Adele Marks was a woman who believed in documents. Not in sentiment, not in oral history, not in the weight of what people claimed to remember. Documents, filed, stamped, dated, witnessed, the architecture of proof that didn't depend on anyone's goodwill. When Loretta brought her the probate filing that Raymond Hargrove had produced, Adele read it twice, set it on her desk, and said, "Diane's legal strategy just became significantly more difficult. She must have known this was filed," Loretta said. "She may have assumed her father signed a will without having it formally notarized. Or she knew it was filed and gambled that you didn't know that tearing the copy would discourage you from looking." Adele folded her hands. Either way, she miscalculated. What followed in the next 10 days was the careful, methodical work of verification. Adele's office contacted Arthur Fenwick directly. Fenwick, 66, a notary of 30 years standing, was precise and unruffled. He confirmed that he had prepared the will, that Walter Hargrove had been examined by a physician within 48 hours of signing and found to be in sound mental state, that 2 independent witnesses had been present at the signing, and that he had filed the document himself with the county probate court. He also mentioned, matter-of-factly, that he kept copies of all documents he notarized going back 30 years in a climate-controlled storage unit, and that he would be happy to provide certified duplicates to any court that requested them. Bryce Calloway, the attorney representing Diane and Colton, was a man of around 50 who had built a career on knowing when to push and when to pivot. When Adele formally notified him of the probate filing and Fenwick's confirmation, there was a day of silence from his office. Then a second day. Then Calloway called Adele directly and asked, in carefully neutral language, whether there was room for discussion. "There is room for the truth," Adele told him. "Discuss that." But something else happened during those 10 days that no one had anticipated. Colton Hargrove called Loretta. Not Diane. Colton, the quiet one. The one who had trailed behind his sister at the funeral like a man who wasn't sure he belonged in the story he'd wandered into. He called on a Thursday evening, and his voice had the sound of a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally reached the point where not saying it cost more than saying it. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right." A pause long enough that she thought the call might have dropped. "Were you ever in Greer County about 23 years ago?" The question landed with the specific weight of something that has been traveling a long time. Loretta was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, and slightly unsteady. "There was a woman. On Route 9. In a storm. I was in my car, and I had gone off the road, and I was not conscious, I think, for part of it. And when I came back around, there was a woman there. She was keeping me warm. She had He stopped. "A quilt," Loretta said quietly. "Blue and cream." The line went completely silent. "I've been looking for that woman," he said finally, "for 23 years. She closed her eyes. This was the part she had known, somewhere in herself, was eventually going to arrive. The moment when the thing she had carried alone would have to be spoken into a room with another person in it. She had imagined it differently. Over the years, sometimes in a legal setting, sometimes in a chance encounter, sometimes not at all. She had sometimes wondered if it would simply never be said, if it would stay folded up inside her like the quilt itself, carried forward without being opened. "Your father knew," she said. "He found out, eventually. That's why he changed the will," Colton said. "Yes." A long, complicated silence. "Loretta," he said, and she noticed that he used her name, not Mrs. Caldwell or ma'am, but her name, as though he had been saving it. "I want to tell you something. Diane doesn't speak for me. She hasn't for a long time. I've been trying to find a way to say that. I believe you," she said. "I want to help. Whatever you need from me, I'll testify if I need to. I'll go on record." His voice broke slightly at the end of that sentence, and he steadied it. "Whatever it takes." After she hung up, Loretta sat at her kitchen table for a long time. The apartment was quiet. The building around her made its small evening sounds, someone's television, the pipes settling, a door closing somewhere above. She got up and went to the bedroom. She opened the closet. She moved the hanging clothes aside and took down the cotton pillowcase from the shelf. She set it on the bed and opened it, and she removed the quilt blue and cream, hand-stitched, even tension, the border pattern her mother had taught her. She unfolded it once, and then again, until it lay open across her lap, slightly faded now, the colors softened by time. She hadn't looked at it properly in years. She looked at it now. The night of November 14th, 23 years ago, Loretta had been driving home from a 12-hour shift at the long-term care facility where she worked. It was nearly 11 o'clock. She had been on her feet for most of those 12 hours, and the fatigue was in her bones in the specific way that follows long work, not sleepiness exactly, but a kind of bodily heaviness that makes the world feel slightly muffled. She had the heat on in the car. The wipers were going as fast as they could go. The rain was the worst she could remember in years. Route 9 through Greer County was a 2-lane road that passed through stretches of woods and farmland with no lights and no shoulders to speak of. She drove it twice a week. She knew it well enough to drive it slowly in bad weather, which was what she was doing. She almost didn't see the car. It was down a shallow embankment to the right, partly obscured by a stand of young pine trees, the headlights angled downward into the mud so that only the peripheral glow was visible from the road. She registered it in her peripheral vision as she passed, and then her brain caught up with what her eyes had seen, and she slowed and stopped, and sat for a moment with the wipers going and the rain hammering the roof. There were no other lights on the road in either direction. She got out. The embankment was slick, and she half slid down it, catching herself on the pine branches. The car had gone forward and to the right, coming to rest at an angle with the front end low and the passenger side against a tree. The driver's door was partially open, which was what had caught her eye, not the car itself, but the interior light showing through the crack in the door. The man inside was slumped against the steering wheel. Young mid-20s, dark hair, pale now from shock or blood loss or both. There was a cut above his left ear, and his left arm had gone through something, the window or the side panel, and the sleeve was soaked dark. His breathing was audible even over the rain, shallow and fast. She checked his pulse, checked his airway. She did not try to move him. She had enough medical training to know you don't move someone who might have a spinal injury without equipment and support. She went back to her car and got her phone and called 911. And then she went back to him. She got the quilt from the back seat. She'd been meaning to bring it inside for weeks, and she tucked it around him as best she could, working through the open door, careful not to jostle his neck or back. She talked to him while she did it, the way she talked to her patients, low and steady, something for the frightened part of the mind to anchor to. He came around briefly, his eyes opened unfocused, then focusing on her face. He said something that was hard to make out over the rain, and she leaned closer. "You're okay," she said. "Help is coming. Stay still." His right hand moved, reaching, and she took it. "Don't go," he said. It might have been directed at her, or it might have been directed at something else, consciousness maybe, or the part of himself that felt it slipping. Hard to know. "I'm here," she told him. "I'm not going anywhere." She stayed there for 22 minutes, crouched in the rain beside the open door of a stranger's car, one hand holding his, the other holding the quilt against him, until she heard the ambulance from a long way off and saw its lights come over the rise. The paramedics came down the embankment with their equipment, and she moved out of the way. She gave them his name. She had found his wallet in the door pocket, and she described what she had observed: breathing rate, responsiveness, approximate duration, the injury to his arm. They were professional and focused and didn't ask her who she was. She didn't offer it. When they had him on the board and were moving him up the embankment, she retrieved the quilt from the back seat of his car, where one of the paramedics had set it aside. She folded it. She walked back up to the road. She got in her car and drove home. She did not follow up. She did not go to the hospital. She did not find out his name, though she had seen it on the wallet, and it had stayed with her, Colton James Hargrove. She did not call to inquire. She had been taught, in her years of medical work, a particular kind of professional separation, the ability to act fully in a moment of crisis and then release it, not because it didn't matter, but because the attachment itself could become a weight that impaired the next moment of crisis. What she did not anticipate was that Walter Hargrove would find out. It had happened 2 years later, through a chain of small coincidences that she had long since stopped trying to retrace. Someone at the county hospital who knew someone who knew Walter, a description that matched too precisely, a date and a road that couldn't be anything else. Walter had called her agency to ask if she'd be willing to come to his home for an assessment visit. He hadn't said why exactly. And when she arrived and he'd opened the door and looked at her, she had seen in his eyes the particular expression of a man who has been searching for something he wasn't entirely sure existed. "It was you," he said. She hadn't confirmed it that first day, but she hadn't denied it either. Over the following weeks, Walter had been careful with her. Careful in the way that people are careful when they know they have received something that can't be repaid and they are afraid of the inadequacy of anything they might offer. He had told her that Colton had spent months trying to find the woman who had stayed with him on the road, that he had recovered fully. The arm had required surgery, but he had recovered, and that the woman was a detail he had never been able to let go of, the quilt in particular. He had described it, blue and cream, hand-stitched. He said he'd felt it even when he wasn't fully conscious, that it had been the thing that made him believe someone was there. Loretta had never told Colton. Walter had asked her why once. "Because I didn't do it so it would be remembered," she had said. "I did it because it needed doing." Walter had been quiet for a long time after that. "I know," he'd said eventually, "but some things deserve to be remembered anyway." He had written the envelope that same week, sealed it, handed it to her, and told her to keep it. He'd said he hoped she'd never need to open it, that it was a record, for a moment when records mattered more than silence. She had kept it for 23 years without opening it. She thought now that the moment might finally have arrived. The probate hearing was set for a Thursday morning in late October, 6 weeks after the funeral. County Probate Court, Courtroom B, 9 o'clock. Diane Hargrove Whitfield arrived with Bryce Calloway and 2 associates, and a confidence that filled the hallway outside the courtroom like weather. She was dressed in dark blue, this time courthouse blue, Loretta thought, the color of authority performed. Calloway was efficient and unsmiling. The associates carried document bags. Loretta arrived with Adele Marks, Arthur Fenwick, and Raymond Hargrove, who had driven in from Savannah the night before and was wearing a gray suit that fit him like a man who had spent decades being precisely himself. They did not see Colton in the hallway. He arrived at 8:58 alone and did not make eye contact with his sister. Diane noticed, a subtle tightening around her mouth, nothing more. The courtroom was not large. A probate judge named Clarence Whitmore presided, 50s, reading glasses, the businesslike air of a man who had seen every variety of family conflict that grief and money could produce. He did not look impressed by any of them. The procedural elements came first, Adele presenting the certified copy of the filed will, Fenwick confirming his notarization and the circumstances of the signing, the physician's attestation of Walter's competency, the witnesses' affidavits, each document placed on the record with the quiet efficiency of people who had prepared carefully. Calloway objected at each stage, formally and professionally. Whitmore noted the objections and moved forward. Then Calloway called his witness. He called a woman named Dorothy Sims, who had been Walter's housekeeper for several years before Loretta's involvement. Dorothy was in her 60s, nervous, and gave testimony that Walter had become confused in his later years, that he had occasionally not recognized family members, that there had been incidents. Adele cross-examined quietly. She established that Dorothy Sims had last worked for Walter 18 months before the will was signed, that she had not been in the house in those final 2 years, that she had no direct knowledge of his mental state at the time of signing. Dorothy left the stand looking slightly smaller than when she'd arrived. Calloway stood again. He was preparing to make an argument about the pattern of manipulation Loretta could see in his posture, the shape of what he intended, when Judge Whitmore removed his glasses and looked at the room. "Before we proceed further," Whitmore said, "I note that one of the named beneficiaries in the original will, Colton Hargrove, is present in this courtroom, and has not been represented by either counsel. Mr. Hargrove, do you wish to address the court? Diane's head turned sharply. Colton stood. He was not a man built for courtrooms. He was a man built for somewhere quieter, a workshop, maybe, or a garden, somewhere that rewarded patience over performance. He stood in the way that people stand when they know they are about to do something irrevocable. Yes, Your Honor, he said, I do. He had brought two things with him. The first was a sworn affidavit, prepared with Adele's assistance in the preceding week, in which he testified to the events of November 14th, 23 years ago, the accident on Route 9, the woman who had found him, the quilt, the hand she had held until the ambulance arrived. He testified that he had spent years attempting to find this woman, that his father had confided in him, in the final year of his life, that the woman in the will was the same woman from the road. That Walter had told him the will was his attempt to honor a debt that no document could fully represent, but that doing nothing was no longer acceptable to him. The second thing Colton had brought was the quilt. He had asked Loretta for it, the week before the hearing. She had given it to him without hesitation. He set it on the table in front of him, unfolded, blue and cream, slightly faded, the stitching even and precise. And he said, in a voice that was steady in the way that things are steady when the effort to hold them steady is visible, "This is the quilt she put over me. I was 24 years old. I had been in that ditch for 17 minutes before she stopped. The paramedics told my father later that another 30 minutes would likely have been too long." The courtroom was quiet. Diane was sitting very still. Calloway leaned toward her and said something she didn't appear to hear. "I want the court to understand," Colton continued, "that this is not a contested will. I do not contest it. My father knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. And I would have told anyone who asked if anyone had thought to ask me." He sat down. Adele had one more item. She stood and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to enter one final document into the record. It is a letter, sealed and dated 23 years ago, written by Walter Hargrove and held by Loretta Caldwell since that date. It was not written for this proceeding. It was written long before any of this was anticipated. With Miss Caldwell's permission, I'd like to read the relevant portion." The judge nodded. The envelope was produced. Loretta had opened it 4 days ago, alone in her kitchen, at the table, with a cup of tea she hadn't drunk. She had read it twice and sat with it for a long time. She had given it to Adele the next morning. Adele read from it now. "To whoever needs to hear this. The woman who held my son's hand on the road that night did not do it for recognition or reward. She did it because she was that kind of person. The world does not always know what to do with that kind of person. The world often doesn't notice them at all. I am writing this because I want there to be a record, somewhere, that says, 'I noticed. I am grateful. And when I am gone, I want what I leave behind to say so.'" Adele set the letter down. Judge Whitmore looked at the room over his glasses for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll have my ruling by end of day." The ruling came at 4:47 in the afternoon. It was 3 pages long and unambiguous. The will was valid. Walter Hargrove had been of sound mind. The evidence of competency was thorough and uncontested by any witness with direct knowledge. The claim of undue influence was unsupported. The estate would proceed to distribution as stipulated. Adele called Loretta from the courthouse. Loretta was at home, at the kitchen table, where she had spent most of the afternoon. She listened to Adele read the summary. She said thank you. She sat for a while after the call ended, looking at nothing in particular. The ruling did not resolve everything at once. These things never do. There were still procedural steps, transfer timelines, appraisals, tax documents. The house on Magnolia Street would not be in her name for another several months. The sum of money, substantial but not extravagant, would go through the proper channels. But the truth was established. It was on the record now, and once a truth is on a record, it belongs to everyone. Diane did not speak to Loretta after the hearing. She walked out of the courthouse with Calloway at her side and got into a car and left. Calloway, to his modest credit, sent a letter the following week that contained a formal withdrawal of the undue influence claim and an acknowledgement clinical, legally precise, but real, that the claim had been without sufficient foundation. It was not an apology, but it was something. The real apology came 3 weeks later. Colton called on a Tuesday evening. He said he wanted to meet. They met at a diner on the east side of town, not the coffee shop where she had met his grandfather. Somewhere smaller, less polished, with better pie. He arrived before her again, like Raymond had. He stood when she came in. They ordered coffee and for a while talked around the edges of what needed to be said. He told her about his business. He ran a small construction firm, residential work mostly, and he was good at it. She told him about the house on Magnolia Street, which she had visited recently and walked through slowly, thinking about what she would do with it. Then he said, "I want to apologize. You have nothing, not for the legal situation, for the silence." He wrapped his hands around his cup, the same gesture she had seen from his grandfather, and recognized now as a family habit, the way certain gestures pass through bloodlines without anyone noticing. "I looked for you for a long time after the accident. And then I got busy with life, and I convinced myself it was the kind of story that didn't need an ending, that maybe it was better as just something that happened, something I carried quietly." She understood that, more than he knew. "But my father knew differently," Colton said. And he was right. He looked at her directly. "You held my hand in the dark in a storm when you had no reason to stop, and I never thanked you." Loretta looked at her coffee. "You don't have to—" "Thank you," he said. "Just that. I've been waiting 23 years to say it, and I want it to be simple, because it is simple. Thank you." She looked at him. He looked like his grandfather in this light, something in the eyes, something steady and slightly tired. She thought about Walter, who had loved this man's complicated, difficult, distant son, and had spent the last 2 years of his life organizing his affairs so that a woman most people had never noticed would know she had been seen. "You're welcome," she said. It was the first time in all of this that she had said it. They stayed at the diner for another hour. They talked about ordinary things, his daughter, who was studying architecture, Loretta's plans for the garden at Magnolia Street, the way the city had changed since they were young. It was the kind of conversation that doesn't need to carry any weight, because everything heavy has already been set down. The agency that had suspended Loretta's registration reinstated it 10 days after the ruling, with a letter noting that the matter had been resolved. The property management company dropped the lease review without explanation. Priscilla brought soup and didn't say "I told you so," which was its own kind of grace. Raymond Hargrove sent a letter handwritten, careful, the diction of a man who had spent a career choosing his words. It said that Walter had done the right thing, and that he was proud of his son for the first time in a long time, and was sorry it had taken him this long to find a reason to say so. At the bottom, in smaller handwriting, he had added, "My son told me you stayed with him in the rain without being asked. That is what courage looks like. I've ruled on many cases in my life. I know it when I see it." She put the letter in the bookshelf, beside the empty space where the sealed envelope had been. The house on Magnolia Street had a porch. It faced west, so in the late afternoons, the light came in at an angle that made everything it touched look like it was made of something warmer than it was. The porch boards needed work. She had made a list, and the garden had gone to seed over Walter's final years, which she thought of not as neglect, but as nature being patient. She was sitting on the porch on an evening in late November, a few weeks after the ruling, with a cup of tea and the particular stillness of someone who is letting a significant thing settle into the ordinary. The neighborhood was quiet. A few houses down, someone was raking leaves. Somewhere behind her, inside, the sounds of a house that was still becoming familiar to her. The particular creak of the hallway floor, the way the kitchen faucet dripped if you didn't turn it all the way. She thought about what Diane had done at the funeral. She tried to do it without anger, which had always been easier for her than for most people. Diane had acted from fear of loss, fear of irrelevance, fear of being displaced from a story she had always believed herself to be the center of. Those fears were not admirable, but they were human. Loretta had spent enough years with dying people to know that grief and greed are often the same thing wearing different clothes. She had not asked for the house. She had not stayed on that road 23 years ago because she wanted something in return. She had not cared for Walter through his final years as a strategy. She had done those things because she was the person who did them, because the world needed people who stopped when others did not, who stayed when staying was inconvenient, who folded the quilt and tucked it around a stranger and held the stranger's hand in the rain. That was not heroism. That was just the work of being a human being who paid attention. But what Walter had understood, and what it had taken her a long time to accept, was that paying attention consistently over a lifetime in the particular way she did it was not nothing. It was something the world needed and rarely honored, and he had wanted to honor it. He could not give her back the years she had spent being invisible. He could not undo the morning at the funeral when 60 people turned to look at her and saw what Diane wanted them to see. He could not reverse the week of unopened mail and suspended registrations and dark blue sedans parked outside her building, but he could leave a record. He could leave a letter. He could make sure that when the moment came, and he had trusted that the moment would come, there would be something on paper that said, "I noticed. I am grateful. She was here, and she mattered, and she was not what anyone assumed." The light moved across the porch boards as the sun dropped lower. Loretta thought about her mother, who had cleaned hotel rooms for 30 years without complaint, about her father, whose knees had given out on the road, about the fact that neither of them had ever been in a courtroom on their own behalf, about the specific quiet dignity of people who do the necessary work without expecting acknowledgement. She had inherited that quality from them. She had carried it without knowing whether it would ever amount to anything visible. It had turned out, in the end, to amount to something visible, not because she had planned for it, not because she had maneuvered or strategized or waited for the right moment, but because she had simply been who she was, consistently, for a very long time, and because one man had noticed and thought it worth recording, she set down her tea. The evening light was almost gone now, that final few minutes of warmth before the sky shifted to its evening gray. From somewhere down the street, the sound of a child calling to someone. The raking sound had stopped. She sat in the quiet. There are women in every town and every city and every community who are known to everyone and seen by no one, who carry things in silence that would have broken louder people, who stop on dark roads when no one is watching, who make quilts from fabric scraps and put them over strangers, and drive home alone in the rain and never mention it. Loretta Mae Caldwell was not an exceptional woman in the way that word is usually meant. She was exceptional in the way that matters most. She had, when it counted, done the right thing, and then she had done it again and again. The world had not always noticed, but the world eventually had. She picked up her tea. She looked out at the garden. She began, quietly, to make plans.